possible, and that one could only dream about crossing. So I'm going to digress a second to tell you that in 78, when India went to play cricket and thought of what it was like on the other side of the border on the very same planet. And it was just extremely exciting. And it's been a journey from that point of contact to find all of the openings and all of the opportunities to make friends. And some of us have been so fortunate that we can actually speak now of lifelong friendships. And Aneela, you know I'm talking about you, that have been possible because of that quest and that very serious, if not always seriously serious endeavor. Saba, I actually first met over email in the days when you couldn't WhatsApp people, because I asked her to contribute to a volume that we did on women and security in South Asia. And she wrote about refugees in Pakistan, Afghan refugees in Pakistan, which was actually, I think, maybe the first thing I ever read on the subject also. So I think I recall your paper all the time that I am writing on this topic. And it's been an important influence in the years. But the more important thing is that Saba and I became friends in the course of this book that took 3 years to actually see the light of day. And when I moved to Chennai, and it was 18 years yesterday since I moved. When I first, so I was also thinking about that, Saba, when I first moved here, my, metaphorically 3 a.m. friends were actually both in Islamabad, Saba and my adopted brother Nasir. These were the 2 people I could call to vent and say, what on earth have I done? Where have I landed? What is this place? I would actually make these calls on my new Airtel mobile number to Islamabad because it was possible. And for somebody who had grown up in 1970s India, the idea that I could pick up this little phone and call across this border and catch them on their way to dropping children at school or going to the market or in their office was just mind-boggling. And I continue to be amazed by this. I am actually, I think for me, we're always dismal about the India-Pakistan relationship. But for some of us who are old enough to remember how it was and to map the everyday changes that have happened, not the big changes, not the geopolitical, not the diplomatic, but the changes in our own lives that were not possible to even imagine, I think has been a great gift and a great privilege. And so I'm now going to read out this utterly inadequate, teensy-weensy bio that Saba has sent us, which barely begins to, please Google her, because this is nothing. Okay, so Saba Gul Khattak is an independent researcher and holds a PhD in political science. She has served in senior positions in the government and non-government sectors. And you see she's turned off her video because she doesn't want to be seen while I read this.
No, ma'am, her internet is a little unstable, so I asked her to switch it off until she begins her talk.
You're responsible for this. Saba's research and policy work focuses on the intersections of gender, governance, structural and direct violence, development, and human rights. You'll find out why this is an inadequate and utterly incomplete bio the moment she starts speaking, which I invite her to do now. So Saba, over to you, and you are so welcome that my heart is bursting.
Thank you, Swarna. You are kind, and it's exciting for me to be connecting with everyone across the border. I was just thinking, I'm sorry if my internet starts to act up, I'll have to turn off the video.
We will turn off the video now so you have a little more bandwidth.
Okay. Yeah, we were just talking about how our friendships across borders are so beautiful. And last night, a friend of mine sent me a link to this beautiful documentary titled We Made Books. It's about Kali for India, starts with Urvashi and Ritu, and in between there's Uma and Shiva. And I just felt so privileged to have known them, to have met them, and the kind of bonds of friendship that continue whether we speak or don't, whether we are in touch or not. We can just pick up from where we had left off. That is something special that I cherish, and I feel very lucky to have had this opportunity, because as a child I could not have imagined anything like this. And I'm sure with Aneela there, I'm sure Aneela could not have imagined she would be living in Delhi after being growing up in Rawalpindi. So these are the kinds of lovely crossings across borders that are beyond words. And today I thought I'll talk about feminism that actually enabled us all to connect with one another as women, as feminists, as activists, as, human beings who sought peace. Um, and I thought I'll talk about the women's movement and feminist solidarities within Pakistan as well as across our boundaries. So I don't really know how you want me to start, Swarna, but should I just jump in?
Just jump in, tell the story however it comes to you and you enjoy it.
Okay. What I find interesting, because as I look back, I mean, at this point in our lives, and you are right, Swarna, it is our generation that has been privileged, and not for everyone are these kinds of ties perhaps as important also. But when I think back, I keep thinking, oh, but where did the peace go that we all thought we were working for? What happened in the 90s? We thought things are going to improve, but today, it's depressing to see that nothing much has improved. So where did all that hard work go and all the passion that we still have? Sometimes it seems structures have become very, very sort of have straight jacketed us. Visa regimes have straight jacketed us. The kinds of government we have now have straight jacketed our ideas. But I feel at the same time, no, not everything has been, that difficult. And there are still movements, there are still voices that are important and that give good ideas to us. So I thought I'll start with the women's movement, because that's one area where there's so much frustration that we, at least in Pakistan, feel about women's rights. What happened? Where did it go? Um, so in that context, I just felt that, initially when I think back of the movement, not from partition time, but even the 60s or 70s, mostly the demands were from the state. And I think, for instance, about, the issue of second marriage in the 60s, because in the late 50s the prime minister had gotten married a second time, and many of the women who were more loyal to the first wife took on the issue, and sort of by 1961 there was an ordinance that said that if a man wants to remarry, he has to have the written permission of the first wife, and that was sort of one of the things. Then Fatima Jinnah fought election. She lost or was made to lose. But that was when the first time Maulvis, the religious clergy, decided that they needed to discuss whether a woman can be a head of state or not. And there were many who felt a woman should not be a head of state. However, later in the 90s or late 80s, we did have Benazir Bhutto as the first woman prime minister. So that debate got settled. But in the 70s, I think one of the things where women's, even though it was very small, but there were defiant voices, was about 1971. 1971, I think the second partition, if you want to call it, was, of course, traumatic. And I think it still continues to haunt all of us on the two sides of India and Pakistan. And there are many friends in India and in Bangladesh. All of us want to write a book about 1971 that we still cannot bring ourselves to do emotionally, because it is such a difficult subject. But in 71, there were women who voiced solidarities with Bengali women, who felt the army had gone overboard, who condemned what was happening in then East Pakistan. And I think that is the first time that feminists were up against the state and saying what is going on, questioning what the state was doing in the name of nationalism. I think that is an important moment. And women's organizations have apologized consistently on behalf of the state, although I find it rather difficult because on the one hand we challenge the state, and on the other hand feminists wish to apologize on behalf of the state for what happened in 1971, the mass killings, the mass rapes, and violence. So it was not only about rape, it was also about the psychological violence that accompanied that. Um, However, by 75, with the World Conference on Women, with more and more support from other feminist movements across the world, I think in South Asia, there was also much more scholarship coming out from the 60s onwards when, women started questioning development. And in the by the 80s there and late 70s, there were many more, like I said, defined crossings across borders where Indian and Pakistani feminists met to talk about partition, to talk about the violence, and to talk not just about that, but about militarization, the militarization of the state. By the early 80s, various anti-women laws had come in and made women unequal citizens of the state. So again, women were in the forefront, and that's the first time that the Women's Action Forum, that claimed to be a feminist organization, a loose organization. It has, no registration as such, but it continues to be the voice of feminists in Pakistan. They came out on the streets against Zia's laws. Um, and there was questioning. And I think these laws were also a direct result of what was going on in Afghanistan, the support for the Afghan jihad that came not just from Pakistan, but from the United States, its allies, everywhere, because it was against the Russians. The Russians had come into Afghanistan, and there was, at that time, the idea of an Islamic jihad was very popular, except it had very, very negative impacts upon women on both sides of the border. And we've documented that to a great degree. Uh, um, the cultural, the social, the political impacts were very, very negative upon women's rights on both sides of the border. So I think a lot of the impetus for peace and against militarization, against conflicts, armed conflicts and violence came in Pakistan to the feminists as a result of what they were experiencing and witnessing. Uh, under Zia's rule, and the need for democracy. So women also forged the women's movement was for democracy, and this is also the time that the rights of various minorities also came to the fore, and women raised their voices not only for women's rights but for minority rights and for peace. And I think this found resonance both in India, in Bangladesh, in women's organizations in Afghanistan. And that's where sort of women, the South Asian Declaration, the Feminist Declaration of 1989, if you read it, it would still be very, very relevant, and it's available on the web. That's kind of like my go-to point, my go-to reference about South Asian feminist solidarity, where they are critiquing their own states, the policies of the state, how the marginalized are being pushed back. And those policies continue to this day, 40 years later, and are relevant today as well. I think in the 1990s, with the restoration of democracy, the women's movement also kind of, we felt at that time it had lost track, though there was CEDAW, there was Beijing, there was more of an inward look, but there were also some outreach for peace. Then in the, post 9/11, I would say once again there is a shift to, and Pakistan experiences a lot of terrorism, a lot of suicide bombings. There were weeks where these suicide bombings were relentless. There were 3 times a week you would find 80 people dead, 100, over 100. They really took a toll on all of us. But this was also the time that women started to demand a dismantling of the laws that Zia had introduced in the name of Islam, and eventually succeeded after almost 25 years, when many of our children, or the children of slightly older, the generation that preceded us, their children were questioning them and saying, why are you still going to these demos against hudud ordinances? Nothing's going to happen. But 25 years later, something did happen. The government did take the teeth out of those ordinances. By the 2000s, there were many other changes. Women did get more quotas within their own, from local government onwards to the national parliament. There were more women, and initially, yes, people were very dismissive. They said, oh, this is the cherry on top of the cake. They are not going to mean much. Oh, people have brought in their maids and so on. Who wants their own, the women from their own families to enter these male spaces? This is not going to work. But it has worked, and worked very effectively. I think women today have a much more stronger voice, because in local government, women realize they can decide on things at their mohalla level, at the street level, in their village. And a lot more women contested local government elections, except later on they decided to reduce the quotas. I think the powers that be and the structures that be did not really want so many women out there demanding their space, their rights, their right to decision making. I think, women would go to the police station at that local level and demand, why is so-and-so's child being hauled up? Or I remember in remote areas, some women who had heard about Benazir Bhutto would go to the police station station and tell the, station officer to put a case against her husband because he's not giving her enough money to run the kitchen, and, under the rule of women, this should not really be happening. And, ask them to put the husband, they would call the husband would say, I didn't get my, to work today, and I'm a daily wager, so if I don't have money, what can I do? But the women had a voice, and they felt they could go to the state and demand that, those institutions should do something for them. I think that kind of a change at that village level came because through the 90s, they saw Benazir becoming a prime minister, being deposed, coming back. She had a voice. I think those role models were important. And then again, at the local government level, in the parliaments, in other areas, there were changes that took place, whether it was because of various feminist organizations. By the 90s, there were many NGOs headed by women who were pushing the boundaries for women's rights. So you can see a change by then. And of course, the preoccupation with peace continues throughout because of the experiences within Pakistan of what communities went through, the kind of conflicts that they experienced. If I can just digress a little bit, we did at SDPI a small project on conflict zones. And actually, when we identified some conflict zones, by the time our teams went there, we wanted to train our younger generation to understand the dynamics and how a conflict zone becomes one. And by the time we would go to the conflict zone, it would have changed. And what we thought were peace zones or where there was peace had suddenly overnight become conflict zones. So, the unpredictability of the whole situation, the fluidity kind of used to hit everyone. And that is what I think pushed everyone to try for more peace, whether it was sectarian conflict, whether it was other kinds of conflict, the suicide bombings, the Taliban, the threat of Taliban, all of that. By 2010, I'm just going in across decades, we find that there were many younger feminists who were, who had very different ideas, and their demands were for more space. They formed their own organizations, they formed their associations. So we have new girls at dhabas claiming basically public space. Why can't a girl go and sit at a dhaba? I hope you understand what a dhaba is. Those tea stalls by the roadside.
The tikris.
The what?
The tikris in India, they call tikris.
Okay, and here it's dhaba. So, or in Peshawar, there were, younger feminists having their feminist reading sessions and so on, called Feminist Fridays. They would get together on Fridays. Various other organizations formed by young women, others that are more socialist in their approach, who would have their own reading circles. But gradually you realize, and then there was Aurat March, which really sent all of our establishment into some kind of a paralysis or a massive reaction, because at Aurat March, the slogans were such that a lot of these men who are really the mouthpieces of the extreme right were very offended. And some of the placards said, find your own socks, I can't find them for you, or heat your own food, or something about the sitting position. We are all taught how to sit as young women. the appropriate posture of having your legs together. And so one woman, had a poster in which she's sitting with her legs apart and says, "Lo baith gayi," there I've sat down the way I want. And so all of this they found extremely offensive. The Aurat March was accused of being some kind of Western agenda, which is the standard critique, that they are here. Oh, one said divorced and happy. So they said these women are here to break homes, and this is against Islam, the usual defense that. And then this year as well as last year, some people went and put a case in a police station saying these women should be arrested, this march should not take place. Basically, women were claiming, they felt if the personal is political, then within the home, we should have freedom. They are questioning their roles as symbols of sexuality or of having to do what all women are expected to do, which is heat food or make a chapati or whatever else. So suddenly, not suddenly, gradually, I think the demands changed in their nature from demanding laws, equality from the state. The younger generation felt, okay, all of that is good enough, but what about the home and what about our own individual rights? So that kind of a shift. Now in this, of course, the older feminists were sometimes trying to tell them, oh, don't say this or don't say that in public, and younger women felt that we don't need to follow that kind of advice. But then when the police would be unleashed, or there would be threats that there were with the Aurat March, there would always be threats from and all these bearded men who were very obviously from religious political parties would also come and throng the venue with big stones in their hands and so on. We would ask for protection, but one wouldn't know which side this is going to be. Also, I forgot in the after the 9/11 situation, with the whole politics of hijab and the veil, piety movements became very strong in Pakistan. Aneela has done her PhD dissertation on one of them, and I'm sure she can speak to this much better than I can. But I still remember in 2007, there was the Lal Masjid fiasco, but before that, there was a madrasa for women, and these women with sticks in their hand and wearing black burqas would go around terrorizing people, telling people what to do, how to dress, especially women. And they became sort of the morality police of Islamabad. We did a demonstration against them, but men would wear the same burqas and show up as well, and with their sticks. So there were actually men standing right next to us in our protest wearing burqas, and I could see their hands. They were much bigger, and their feet that were protruding from the burqas, you could tell. So there were these kinds of confrontations before also, but now those confrontations have become far more intense. Because on the one hand, there has been all the indoctrination in our education, in our culture, of that injection of Islamic jihad from the 80s that has continued to be injected into Pakistan for various reasons of identity, of other issues, especially after 71, when the whole issue of whether Pakistan was made for Muslims to be able to practice Islam, or was it to protect a minority? A minority, but turns out to be a country where other religious minorities are persecuted. So all the ironies that have been pointed out. many times by human rights workers, have been there. At this point, I feel that, across borders as well as within Pakistan, the women's movement has, and the feminist movement has diversified. Whether that means it has become diffuse or it is going in different directions, and actually there are feminist solidarities across generations, that we need to now begin to think about and strategize for. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, and Saba. I mean, I think we've been traveling with you through the decades, listening. And I was also thinking, though, looking at some of the people here, that maybe some, can you tell us a little bit more before we kind of open up for questions, a little bit more about the changes that took place in the Zia years? I mean, more broadly than the ones that you referred to, because I think that for a lot of the some of the younger listeners, that might not be such a familiar reference, especially in South India.
Yeah, I understand. So,
and Aneela, you are not off the hook, huh? Especially now that Saba has mentioned your book. I'm going to ask you something.
Saba's day, I can't hijack everything, right?
Arere. No. You never hijack. But Saba.
Don't use that word, Aneela.
Ye bhi hai.
Self-censorship. Well, what happened was, post 71, there is a crisis in Pakistan, a crisis of identity, a crisis of the military, its role, its position. And, there is, before that in the 60s, again, we had a military dictator. Finally, we held elections, except the political parties couldn't agree to the idea that Awami League had won the election and Mujibur Rahman could be the prime minister. So that led to, a crisis, political crisis in the country, with Bhutto becoming the chief martial law administrator, actually, a fact that we would like to forget, but it is there. Who then, of course, assumes his role as prime minister, puts in various policies, is more of, came on a very progressive agenda of roti, kapda, or makan, which is bread and clothes and shelter. I just translated it. Maybe it's not a good translation. And then the kind of policies he was pursuing, of course, and he had his own hand-picked general, Ziaul Haq, who he thought would not be a threat, except the kinds of policies he introduced alienated many, many classes, whether it was through the ruling classes, of course, whether through land reform or nationalization of industry. It became a threat to about every class of people. And so it was very convenient to bring in a military dictator in the guise of, a movement for Islam and, bringing Islam back in. So Ziaul Haq took over, made sure Bhutto is hanged in a court case that is still questioned. And Zia, who came in 1977, was initially, of course, he promised to relinquish rule in 90 days, hold elections, but of course they kept getting postponed. And then the Russians came into Afghanistan, Russian tanks entered as they called it the Christmas gift, 25th December 1979, which gave Ziaul Haq a new leash on power, because the Americans were only too happy to work with a dictator because, it's simpler, easier to make decisions. They promised Pakistan aid, which Jimmy Carter had offered, and Ziaul Haq famously said that's peanuts to a peanut farmer. And then, of course, massive military aid, training, CIA, collaboration with Pakistan's ISI, came about. The Afghan refugee camps were used for very, very political motives. Refuge was granted on the basis of the families signing up for one warlord or another, and based on how many families had signed up for one particular leader, Mujahideen leader, their following was determined, and based on that following, they were given arms, training, fighting. So the amount of money they would receive was based on how much strength they could demonstrate in the camps. And of course, in the refugee camps, women were the ones there were fatwas, religious edicts coming out, crazy kinds of fatwas that would come out about every week, instructing women not to step out, not to wear perfume, not to wear jewelry that can go clink, 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 things like that, and enforcing strict Islam. And of course, I contend that the success of the jihad was predicated upon the isolation of women under so-called religion and these injunctions, because the fighters needed to be sent back into Afghanistan, the men trained to go back and fight inside Afghanistan, and the only circumstances under which they could go with ease of mind was that their women were not interacting with any other men while they were not there. So it was very convenient. And Pakistan also, Pakistani women suffered because they are also brought in the whole Islamization um, laws, specific laws that made women unequal. And if you want to know exactly what they were, these pertained to three different areas. One was financial equality. One was about a woman's, which sprang from a woman's ability to be a witness. So they said women are the equivalent of one man in terms of being witnesses for anything, even a financial contract. You needed two women to be witnesses, so two women and one man, or you could get two men. But if there were women, then one woman two women were the equal of one man. This, in some sense, is still there in some of the financial practices that we have. Similarly, the issue of adultery. Zia introduced all these very, very primitive punishments. For instance, chopping the hand if there is a theft. So if a thief is caught, then his hands were to be chopped. If someone was in an adulterous relationship, then they would be stoned to death. The only problem was many times rape, because there were no witnesses to a rape, would be turned into a case of adultery, and then people would be punished. And there was one famous case of Safia Bibi, a blind girl who was working at someone's house where she was raped and became pregnant. Instead of, she was accused of um, fornication and was to be punished, except she was blind and had been raped, and there was no way of establishing because there were no witnesses. And this became kind of the case that made the point of how unfair these hudud laws were. Later on, Zia there were various incidents of violence against women, very, very bizarre ways of expressing that violence, women being paraded naked. If the Chaudhry's power was challenged in a village. So things like that were happening. And so then Zia came up with this punishment of if anyone does that, they will immediately receive a death sentence. Which judges had a hard time giving because, and similarly for gang rape, uh, judges would have a hard time giving the death sentence because they felt this was not a just thing to do. So it really was counterproductive. But these were the hudud ordinances against which women fought. Other than this, there were, of course, militarization, Islamization combined, and I'm not trying to say that it was a particular interpretation of Islam which today the Taliban espouse. Um, it's not, I mean, religion, no religion I think is bad in intent, but it's how we interpret it. Till now, I can give you another example. Till now, to go to Saudi Arabia for Hajj or Umrah to visit Mecca, women were required to have a man accompany them. But now Saudi Arabia has waived off that condition. I grew up, and until now, this year, I thought this was according to some Islamic tenet, but it's obviously not because Saudi Arabia has waved it off. And so it's how you interpret religion, who interprets it, who enforces it. So I think that's what I want to sort of emphasize, that under Zia, Islamization and militarization of state institutions, and a culture subsequently because of what was happening in Afghanistan, because of how that whole idea of Islam and resistance were combined by the United States, where in the University of Nebraska, various textbooks were produced for refugee children, asking them, the image of guns, 1 + 1 is equal to how many, 1 gun + 1 gun is equal to how many guns, or if you kill one kafir, one communist, or two communists plus injured this many, how many will that be? All that violence was very systematically taught in refugee schools. And where did the curriculum come from? It didn't spring out of this country, it sprang from Nebraska. So all of this combined, what I'm trying to say is there was a culture, even in universities, our university in Peshawar, which is next door to Afghanistan, we had the road bifurcated footpaths, established for girls and a different footpath for boys. A chadar or a dupatta covering our heads was required in public life on campuses. These were the kinds of impacts that cannot be, that were there. They were there, and they have been sort of infused into the body politic of Pakistan. And this happened simultaneously as the war in Afghanistan progressed. So I hope I've been able to explain exactly what happened. And which is why we are fearing what is going to happen in Afghanistan today, what is with the Taliban now on the verge of taking Kabul. And it is extremely worrisome when I think of what is happening there, when I think of a repeat of, so many refugee migrations across generations of women who have to once again contend with, and I find it very hypocritical of the US to leave in the manner it has left, and to sort of conveniently say it is all Pakistan when they themselves were in talks in Doha with the Taliban without inviting any representative of the Afghan government. It's just convenient to put the blame on someone, but really, as the Chaudhrys of the world, they need to take responsibility about what is happening today in Afghanistan. And so the fears that we had from the 80s and 90s are coming back again on both sides of the Durand line for women.
Saba, elsewhere you have written about how, if we were looking at the human development indicators up till 79 in what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and elsewhere in Pakistan, they were parallel. And the kind of regressive views people have about Pashtun society right now, right? Which came because of the Afghan intervention. Like, for instance, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, I think in India, we are familiar with a history of non-violent political Islam and how a whole generation suppressed that memory. It would not work for the US-Pakistan project if the Pashtuns had refused to pick up arms, right? Like this was again this edited volume that you had contributed on for women in Pakistan about the kind of rules which were enforced for Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which was not for the rest of Pakistan. And why, like, my heart breaks, your heart breaks when the kind of racism that you face being Pashtun, right? Okay. Like, I think just like a week ago, we had a female Pakistani Olympian who had said, okay, anyone who is, have these prejudices against women or have a Pakhtun state of mind. So how that state of mind was created in the first place. And because I grew up in 80s Pakistan, and in our case, we had, if you were going to college, and if you wanted to go to a good college, they were under the cantonment board, and you had like a serving general deciding how female students, what they would wear. And if I had to join a particular college, I had to sign in that I will abstain from political conversation. Makeup pe pabandi hai, like makeup is completely prohibited, and the chadar will be an essential part of my uniform. And how we, of course, if you are a 16-year-old, you will throw anyone under the bus to get in, right? Like I had yet to meet Saba and have a strong sense of feminist politics. But how we got around is, and how the principal, they would say that once a month we're going to do a surprise check. So it is good that you just put your chadar in your school bag. So my chastity was in my school bag. It would come out once a month, right? That we would show. So I'm interested how, like, Saba has written that growing up in Rawalpindi, how would have imagined being in Delhi. When they say that those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it, I have been condemned to repeat it in Dhaka, in Delhi, in Rawalpindi, because I didn't learn my lessons well. So living in Delhi now is like being in 80s ka Pakistan, right? I'm being taught about the merits of compliance. I'm taught about how discipline and efficiency is so good. I'm taught about citizen, being a vigilante. And so, yes, I think I should have had a very different dream. Okay, I think that is enough for me.
And how to pack your chadar in a school bag. Let's not forget that.
Yes, my chadar, yeah. But yes, I think that's why I'm very comfortable in Delhi, because I know what the rules are, right? And now instead of a chadar, I have like my son. Like I remember if I had to negotiate the roads early morning, and if I had a toddler boy in a stroller, he was my chastity then. The gaze is very different when you're with your I don't know what kind of, how much self-censorship should I do when I have growing up in Pakistan, they would always say, take someone with you. And this could be a 5-year-old boy, or in this case, a 3-year-old boy, that you had to have a portable penis with you to show we're good people. So if my boy was not with me, the gaze would change. Now, of course, he's 12-year-old, so it's a very different, like, it's very interesting how I negotiate the public space here. How the dupatta gets pulled down, like, when I'm going somewhere, if the boy's not there. So yes, yeah, some lessons I've learned well, huh?
This is your chance to ask questions. I think Neha seems to have, oh, here she is. Yeah. The floor is open. You can just turn on your video as long as your bandwidth permits and ask. But Saba, as you were talking, I was also thinking that that period, 78, 79 onwards, till about 2000 is also the period when all of us got to meet and interact. So there's a weird way in which the bad years have good things, and I guess the good years have bad times too. The opening up happened really in that same time across for each other, not really maybe within our societies. Maybe we were moving in a different direction internally. But so just thinking about the coincidence of that. I met Aneela in 93, and I got to know you in 96, 97.
Yeah, RCSS needs to be thanked for many of our.
Yes. Yes, yes.
Just sort of a footnote to what Aneela said about the Pashtuns. It's very true, and I mean, even Imran Khan made some stupid statement recently about how the Pashtuns will fight all the time among themselves, and then if someone from outside comes, they'll start fighting with the outsider. But the point is, it's from Waziristan, which is the heart of where the whole Taliban and a lot of violence took place, from where this new movement, a non-violent movement for rights, started, called Pakhtun Tahaffuz movement. But the ideology definitely is non-violent. However, I find that they also suffer from the same issues when it comes to any kind of inclusion of women. They just can never find women to come into their movement, and some of the women are borrowed from other places. But yeah, so I don't feel so comfortable, because whenever you talk about including women with them, they just brush it aside. So even there you find a lot of conservatism.
There's a question in the chat regarding the cross-border meeting of feminists. Was it intersectional? What was the outcome of that meeting, and how did that shape the feminist movement of Pakistan?
Well, there is no one meeting. There were lots and lots of meetings, conferences, workshops. Also not just for NGOs, but for the media, for people in the justice sector. It was very diverse, I would say. The Pak India Peace Initiative, in which I remember meeting Truffle and so many other anti-nuclear activists, Achin. So it was not just about women's rights, it was feminists and other peace activists, everyone coming together, whether it was to condemn nuclearization of the subcontinent, saying this is crazy, we need to build hospitals for our people. So yeah, you can say it was intersectional. It was about democracy. There were concerns for minorities on both sides of the border. There were the fisher folk. There were who would be regularly, and I think still are regularly, jailed on both sides because they by mistake venture into the waters of the other side and are picked up in no time and put into prisons where they languish for years, and then there are organizations on both sides trying to arrange their return. So there's then there's all the other conferences that happen, say in Nepal or Sri Lanka, like I mentioned, RCSS. There was one a couple of years ago before COVID struck us in Nepal, on where we there were lawyers who came together from South Asia, human rights defenders, talking about, how to do empowerment of the poor or on capital punishment, so on and so forth. So really there's been different groups, but all of them sort of dedicated to the same issues of justice. I would say that is what connects them. Bottom line is justice and peace.
Unmute and ask, Stuti.
All right. Hi. Thank you so much for a lovely presentation. And I have a question. You mentioned the Aurat March. So I just wanted to ask you about the Imran Khan government and how feminist movements are tracking there, because he keeps making comments about women dressing up, dressing down, or whatever he fancies at the moment. So how are things, because we all know what's happening to civil society in India, but a little more on what is happening in Pakistan would be good to know now.
Yeah, I think what happened, Aneela said she feels she's living in the 80s Pakistan. And what is happening with civil society, I feel we are following, inspired by India. This is another thing I observed. On the surface, both sides, the bureaucracies and so on, will have their cutthroat, whatever, they will behave like enemies. But then you meet at different kinds of events and you see the two ambassadors will be laughing away at their experiences. They will be joking with one another. So there is this strange camaraderie between the two countries as well, even amongst the track 2 officials. And of course, they will be tracing their lineages across their borders and so on. So coming to Imran Khan, and also when I was at the Planning Commission, I would always hear this stuff about the Indian Planning Commission has done this, and so we should change this, that, the other. And then if I visited India, I remember Sayyida Hamid would ask me, how do you people do this in the Planning Commission? Do you write the ACR? I said, yes, I write the ACR. That's why they are responsive to us. So we don't have it. I must make this change here. So, they will, because the bureaucracies have the same kinds of horrible rules that will not let you move without 200 miles of red tape. Imran Khan and Aurat March, Imran Khan, what can I say? He will make the most horrific statements in the world, and with the utmost of confidence. When he had formed his political party, I remember many of the feminists were aghast at his ideas of justice. He was glorifying the jirga, saying that's instant justice. There's no courts as such. People just decide the case on merit and people get justice, except there were no women included in that jirga system that he glorified and romanticized. So it's not something new. He's been saying these things for the last 20 plus years, or 30 plus years, sorry. And what he said about Aurat March is, or how women should be clothed, I think he keeps on saying, it's about context. It's about context. No one believes him. Aneela, if you want to add.
The first article, like the op-ed that he had written for the news, when he had started speaking about this whole brown Sahab culture, he was deriding women who join NGOs and then don't breastfeed their children and give them a bottle ka doodh, right? Kya hai? What is that? The top feeds and bottle feeding. So, one knew where he was coming from. I think I get nervous when he uses the same regressive mentality, but it extends to his foreign policy. That same interview where he had spoken about women dress a particular way and men are not robots, right? Like, I thought the ideal man, jo Hegel ka, jo Allama Iqbal was telling us was about something else, but I've realized the ideal Muslim man was supposed to be a robot. But see, in the same interview, he was also quizzed about the Pakistan-China relationship, and why Imran Khan, like, just looks the other way when it comes to how China is behaving with the Chinese Muslims. And thrice he was asked, and thrice he said, we will have these conversations, but we will have them behind closed doors, right? This whole idea that he has about the sanctity of the home, about chadar and char divari, about if there are any domestic disputes or the domestic violence bill, it has to stay indoors. He extends that to his foreign policy also. This is what is worrisome, right? That he says, no, if we have any questions with them, it will be behind closed doors, and the elders will have a nice little jirga about it. So yes, this is what is bothersome, and it should be bothering everyone else too.
So I want to go back to talking about the women's movement. Oh, sorry, there is another question here, so I won't use up my privilege. What was the role of civil society in Pakistan to empowerment of women in the Zia regime? This is from Ashraf Raza.
The media, if I include civil society to include media, was heavily censored. But I remember some of the leading newspapers when something was censored, the newspaper would have these blank columns that had nothing, but that said it all, that whatever was there has been censored. That was a big statement. I think there was a lot of resistance that came from journalists. And there's some who have sort of given interviews about how they felt. There were some journalists who were given publicly, who were lashed in public, received lashes for their ideas. There was no freedom of expression, but people defied it. People used to do wall chalking. Students did a lot of wall chalking. It was, I would say it was about the larger context of democracy. Women are at one level subsumed under it, but at another level, I do believe that when they came out on the streets under Zia to demand that hudud ordinance should be changed or completely sort of abolished, there was a lot of support that came from all the people who believed in progressive politics. And in a sense, the women who came out had also come out from certain political movements. It's not like they were not without their own experience. So they were also, when their demands were also supported by men in progressive political movements, progressive student politics. And so at one level, when what was happening at JNU and other campuses in India, I felt like we had gone through that. When Aneela says the 80s Pakistan, we had gone through similar stuff on our campuses in the 80s. So it was really a larger fight for democracy, and within that, all the people who were for democracy also supported women's rights, right to be equal citizens of the state, for which they did push. And so did political parties. I mean, Benazir Bhutto herself, they were trying to sort of not allow her to become the prime minister or head a political party because she was a woman. So it's like the movement for restoration of democracy, women's rights were intrinsically sort of one and the same in many contexts. Exactly what happened, I think a lot of the NGOs that we see today who have been talking about women's rights, like Shirkat Ga, Aurat Foundation, these organizations were formed in the Zia years. I think the first one to be registered was Shirkat Ga in the late 70s. Aurat Foundation came, so did many other organizations in Lahore, like Negat Said Khan, who led Asar, Seamorg, many other women's organizations, as well as labor rights organizations, community rights, various organizations were formed in the 80s to address many of the issues that people faced. So yeah, women's empowerment in that sense came out of political movements, out of movements for rights, and sort of coalesced also as the NGOization of the women's movement at one level.
So let me now ask my question, which if you asked me back, I would not know how to answer. So I'll also say that right away. You know, we are fond of talking about women's movements and feminist movements in the plural. But if you had to do something of a mapping and say, well, these are the kinds of initiatives and groups and so on, NGOs that make up this category of women's movements, what would be some of those? I'm sure they'd be pretty similar, but just so that we understand, because people tend here and there, people tend to talk about us in one stereotypical thing. They have short hair, they do this, they do that. Who are we actually? We're so different. I mean, North and South, we are different. Within Tamil Nadu alone, there are so many different strands. So
yeah, I would put all of them under the women's movement, because not all of them are feminist, right? But in their own way, they may be asking for women's rights, and some of the piety movements are that, and some of the critiques we have but haven't really written about are of diaspora scholars and activists who have their own ideas. I mean, there was one time when they were almost supporting the Taliban, saying these are actually the subaltern fighters. This is what, they are the resistance movement when Taliban took over Swat in 2008-9. And diaspora feminists who have been critiquing feminists within Pakistan, saying they have not talked about US imperialism and this, that, the other, who were actually supportive of the piety movement, saying this is an issue of class and this is what Western imperialism and white feminism has done. And so there was a lot of glorification of these madrasa movements of women coming out of Oxford, colonial guilt, all of that, whereas we were critiquing them, saying this is not, the morality brigade with their burqas and their sticks, pulling women out of homes, accusing them of running brothels, giving punishments, whatever. But for our diaspora feminists, all of this was very much part of an indigenous organic reality. For us, it was not at all organic or indigenous. So there are many fault lines. There are many fissures, not just within Pakistan, but also, within various categories. But I feel that they are all part of a women's movement. There are definitely, and then there's the older feminists or other organizations that were like what we call APWA, All Pakistan Women's Association, that were more along, wives of bureaucrats and others who would talk about welfareist kind of stuff, distributing sewing machines to women and silai kadai training, embroidery and all of that. So yeah, there are many different types of organizations of women who are involved, and then there's those who are promoting women's entrepreneurship, microfinance, things like that the World Bank and so on loves. So there are very diverse groups. And I think they are part of a larger stream. That's how I look at it.
And it seems to me, from the little that I've read, that the Aurat March brought many of these strands together. Would that be an accurate, distant impression?
Well,
I mean, not permanently, but in a moment.
Many of the feminists, but certainly not the religious right. They have their own hijab day, and they have their own haya day. They have very different views about, so they don't like or approve of Aurat March. I'm sure Aneela can give some funny incidents that I can't remember, but she's busy. Maybe
she's moving devices.
Okay.
But I was actually going to ask her, one of the things that we sometimes talk about, and this is for both of you, is, as feminists, we want women to have agency and to participate. And then we also are very particular about what we would like them to participate in and what we don't want them to be a part of. So just as individuals, how would you, address, approach, deal with that quandary? I mean, on Monday, I might say, get out there, it doesn't matter what you do. And on others, just go back inside if this is what you're going to do. So offer you that quandary.
For me, I remember post 9/11 looking at lots of young women, especially some who came to SDPI as research assistants, research associates, with their heads covered strictly, wearing hijabs and so on. My heart sank. And I asked one of them, I said, listen, we fought against the charter because it was imposed on us. I hated it. And here you are wearing this whole headgear or something we fought against, so there could be space for your generation not to have to wear it, but there you are wearing it. And of course, I understood that it was part of identity politics, especially if you were coming from the UK, France, US, whatever, Europe. So I do understand that times change, and what was oppressive to us is actually an expression of empowerment to the younger generation. And what one needs is more empathy and more understanding. But of course, one draws the line. And I cannot go out there and be that empathetic to some of these piety movements that are there. And those are days when I say, please go back.
Aneela?
No, and Saba, the hijab is very different from the dupatta. I said the hijab is very different than the dupattas our grandmothers were wearing, right? It's a very different marker also. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it is this also. were you asking how Saba and I differ when how we approach?
No, not that I actually don't assume you differ at all, but I just think that this is a daily quandary for those of us that spend one part of the day writing about 1325 and women's participation, women should be in politics, and then we want to choose their politics for them, you know? So, I mean, how do we balance that? So just as feminists, activists, whatever, women, people, so just
once upon a time, I think Iqbal Ahmed was asked about his experiences being a Bihari Muslim and then in Pakistan. And he said that the principles were the same. So for instance, if there was violence, only the tools had changed. I feel if, growing up in Pakistan, if we didn't have social media, but what we would do is they would ask us, there were these, these parchis, they would ask us to write something on a slip and make 5 copies and distribute it. Now we have these terrible WhatsApp forwards, right? So, the revolution is on social media, and I think the regression is on social media, but it was the same kind of regressive mindset growing up also. I feel, I don't know. Why do can you hear me?
On and off, but now, yes.
Yeah. Yes. So, so where was I?
Can't hear you
like
again.
Maybe if where someone, yeah. Okay. Now I think I'm unmuted, right?
No, now we can hear you.
Now I'm muted. No, what I'm trying to say is that did you catch when I was referring to Iqbal Ahmed and the tools of violence? Like say, like he said, like growing up, if his grandmother would take up a stick and use violence, and now of course they had, the basic violence is the same, that you have modern tools. So I said, if growing up, if we had what I get very irritated by the WhatsApp forwards now, growing up, they would have this, that someone like would say that we had a dream and these are the 5 principles of faith that you have to follow, and everyone makes 5 little chits and you pass on, and then you ask them, and if you don't, the skies will fall down. So I really feel that like our tools now, because I'm watching what the young women in Audit March, what they're doing. But I feel like I've had this conversation with Saba about, like the kind of stakes, what Saba's generation, which was of course not so long ago than mine also, like, it's very different now, right? Because I think with, when VAF took over this, the streets, there were court cases against them. They were pulled in jail. Right now, it is there is this middle class anxiety, right, about the court cases against them. This is it. I don't know if I answer you correctly, but
I don't think there's actually an answer. I think I was sort of hoping against hope that you both have a formula that I could flick.
I feel that I'm enamored by what girls at Dhaba are doing and what Aurat March is doing, but it's also like I feel like with the girls of Dhaba, about there is a particular class of women who are always frequenting those dhabas. It is just that it's now middle class Pakistani women who wanted to access those tea places, right? It is this whole thing about the shurfa, that the shurfa, like it's for instance, what Saba was speaking about the hijab, right, and about how women were dressed a particular way. If I was in the car, that was my hijab, right? It had portable seclusion. I could wear what I want as long as I was sitting in the car and then getting off at someone's house. It is very like I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent right now, but what I'm trying to say is that I really feel like if there was something remarkable about the women movement in Pakistan for the 80s and the 90s, right? Where most of the hard work of getting down in the trenches were there. It's, we just, as I've said, really like enjoying the fruits of their labor. And
but that, to be fair, is true of every generation, you know.
Yeah, but it's but I think the kind of maybe the violence that this generation is facing might be different, or maybe I'm like, you know, the events of the last 2 weeks there, you know, we are still reeling, right? So Arhan, I'm just going to excuse myself for 2 minutes.
Sure, we're about to wrap up anyway, so any other questions? I think everyone here has asked something at one point, so I will just, Mariam, do you have a question?
No, ma'am. I think I had one, but I think Stuti asked it already.
Okay, all right. Okay. So, Saba, thank you so much for opening up this regional, which is this world of regional opportunities for us with your talk and allowing us to celebrate Independence Day weekend together. I mean, obviously, we could have done this in July, we could have done this in September, but it was so perfect to have you here on August 14th and to be together on a day that, on a weekend. Aneela is right about this being a joint Independence Day weekend. To be together this weekend to talk about these issues and to remember the things that the struggles we still have in common, and also all the good things, the friendship, the sharing, and the shared hopes also for generation after us, which can also benefit from that as we work on it. So thank you so much, Saba. Thank you everyone who was here and added so much to the conversation. And we will see you back. We will have you back, Aneela, as a speaker, because Aneela's book is really remarkable. And so if she's willing, we will do that. We will see everybody here again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Swarna. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to meet everyone. And really, it's been lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. Saba, you be warned. This is the first of many. Now that we've opened this door, we won't close it again.
Great. Great. Let's keep collaborating, get more of our younger generation involved and start off with them.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.